Hi, my name's Cecilia Poullain, and welcome to this episode of Brave New Women. All around the world, there are amazing, ordinary women doing extraordinary things. Brave New Women is about giving those women a platform and a voice, and it's about changing the way that women are perceived. And it's a way of inspiring all of us to do the things that we've always wanted to do. Today, I am absolutely thrilled to be speaking to Jane Ferguson. Jane has the most incredible credentials as a war correspondent. She's been on the front line in all the major conflicts of recent times. So she's been in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, Syria, Ukraine, and I imagine others. She's won multiple awards. She's a foreign correspondent for PBS NewsHour and a writer for the New York Times. And she's also working as a McGraw Professor of Journalism at Princeton University, and in particular on teaching a course on war reporting. So Jane, welcome.
Thank you.
Jane, you grew up in Northern Ireland and you grew up during the Troubles. And I wanted to start by asking you the links that you make between growing up in that very particular context and the choice that you made as a career.
It's the connection is so much clearer to me now as I look back and connect the dots. If you'd asked me 15 years ago, I would say, well, I grew up in a very rural place. I grew up I had wanderlust. I wanted to get out into the world. I look back now at that little girl and I see more to it than that. First of all, there weren't a lot of female professional role models. It was a pretty patriarchal society. I was born in the mid 80s in Northern Ireland, and I didn't have a lot of women around me who had very big dynamic sort of professional careers that really appealed to me. But I was absolutely transfixed by the fact that, women on the TV every evening reporting the news were not only traveling all over the world, but they were asking men questions and they were answering them. Don't forget that I write about this a bit in my book, that we were also, at least within a lot of the Protestant Ulster Scots society, we could be fairly secretive about the Troubles and about the conflict that was going on around us. And these women on the television in the evening were commanding everyone's attention, and they were telling stories, and they were answering a lot of these questions or demanding answers to a lot of the questions that I had as a little girl. So I think that made a massive impression on me. Another thread that I've discovered looking back is so much of my career has involved really trying to understand and report in an in-depth way on insurgencies. I have spent more time than many of my colleagues in the industry sort of fascinated by and accessing and sneaking across borders to talk to rebels. Whether I'm in Darfur or I'm talking to Hamas, the Taliban, whether we're all over the world, the Houthi rebels in Yemen. And this has been a big part of my work because I think I was just always so fascinated by what was it that makes people commit, otherwise ordinary people, non-professional soldiers, commit acts of extraordinary violence, to rise up against the odds and to, at times murder their neighbors. And I look back, I see a little girl who was growing up in the last Protestant village before you got to the real IRA heartlands of South Armagh. And all I knew back then was that the IRA were these bands of men living and working in the hills somewhere, and you couldn't see them, but they were out there. And to our communities, they were like the bogeymen. And I think that had an impression on me. I wanted to know, I wanted to understand. And that definitely fed into the type of journalist that I became.
But there's two questions I'd like to come back on in what you've just said. The first is, you said that you noticed these women on the television. Um, what was it, you think, that made you notice that it was particularly women who were asking these questions, rather than what made you distinguish between the fact that it was a male journalist and a female journalist?
I think when I think back to it in terms of scenes, and I'm a little girl in the room, I think what really made an impact on me was, first of all, everybody was shushed so that we could all listen to what this woman was saying. And I think that the little girl in me had never seen rooms full of men fall silent and shush each other so they could listen to what this woman was saying. And basic as that is, I think that was something in me knew that was different and extraordinary and that I hadn't seen that before. And then when I'm watching these women, and they are, I notice that they're women because they are, they look just like, a lot of, they look pretty much like normal women. This is British TV, so it's not like the glamour of American TV. These are BBC correspondents. They look like women, regular women in, I'm thinking of like the first Iraq war. They're in Kuwait, or they're in China covering Tiananmen Square, or they are, they don't look like movie stars. They look like ordinary women doing their jobs. I think that had a real impression on me. And I think also the way they carried themselves and the way that they spoke. They spoke like they're telling stories, but they're so commanding. I think I looked at them and thought that's just that there was something about them that was both attainable and extraordinary.
And you were also talking about insurgencies and making the link between the IRA and the IRA, who were your boogeymen, and insurgents. And have you come to any conclusions about why ordinary people rise up and do extraordinarily violent things to their neighbours?
I really have. I think even as a youngster, I understood, I think this is what actually piqued my interest, was I understood that, there was no moral truth to anything, right? That what was wrong that the IRA would shoot dead soldiers. But then I also recognized very early on that there was an incredible amount of repression going on in Northern Ireland under British rule, certainly in the early days of the Troubles. So I understood also, I write about this in my book as well, people being shot, but everybody then being relatively hush-hush about it because they were sometimes part of armed groups or part of a military or part of a side. So this idea of combatants versus non-combatants, and this is not the language I would have used as a youngster, and the idea that morality can bend, I had an inkling about it as a kid, and I wanted to know more. And in my years on the road, especially covering quote unquote terrorism does exist in its originally intended sort of classification. But of course, as a word, it's been massively abused and politicized. And so I find it fascinating. I was fascinated. I wanted to go out and understand more. And I suppose my big takeaway from that is understanding that it's very, very rarely true that the enemy that someone is speaking about has no moral framework. They do. It's just completely different from yours. If you're looking at the Taliban, and this is certainly not to excuse or take sides, but it is wrong to say silly things like, they hate us because we're free. They hate you because they think you are godless, and they prioritize a connection to God. And so, it's not to say that I believe in moral equivalency, but I understand that every single group has its own value system. That value system might be utterly disgusting to someone like me, who thinks it's outrageous that women can't leave the house and go and get an education, or that you would cut someone's hand off regardless of what they had done. So, but value systems exist, and learning about them is the only way, I think, to have a true understanding, or at least to try to understand why people do the things that they do, which is really essential to being a journalist.
And so if you've got two, what you seem to be saying is that there are two value systems that are coming into conflict. And so it seems to me that if you've got two value systems coming into conflict, the way to deal with that is not to go shoot somebody. It's to start to unwind the fact that there are different value systems. And, through dialogue and understanding and listening and all those things.
Dialogue and understanding are always, should be the goal. I think the difficulty will be when, a value system does not wish for dialogue, and I don't think I think that's rare. Most cultures around the world have inbuilt in them actual, structures and cultural norms around dialogue and conflict resolution. Whether it's a lawyer jirga in Afghanistan or, a specific like peace hut tribal meetings in places in West Africa, there are formal ways to sit down and talk, but, violence ensues because there's always a tipping point at which a group has decided that they will not, be able to achieve whatever it is they wish to achieve that is motivated by their own value system any other way. And so I don't, I don't know if it's possible to avoid war entirely, or if what we really need to get to is whether or not we can use our understanding of value systems to simply end wars more quickly.
Right. And tell me a bit more about. So you were going in and talking to insurgent groups. How did that happen? How did you manage to get to talk to them? How did they receive you? Maybe just give me some examples of that.
I mean, it's interesting. I think everybody assumes, I think people overlook how much politeness and social culture plays into every single, culture I've ever been to around the world. And don't forget, insurgent groups don't think they're barbarians. They think they're the civilized ones. So they would be horrified. They'd be like, well, of course we gave them lunch. Well, they're our guests. And these might be people who would, murder their prisoners, and that's what I mean by value systems. And so a lot of cultures are massively prioritize hospitality and formality and a sense of how guests are to be treated. The other thing I would say is that, from a practical standpoint, you simply have to make contact. Some insurgent groups understand media and understand the value of being interviewed. I mean, some of them to a deeply cynical perspective, and there'll be propaganda and there'll be dog and pony shows. But very often, say for instance, I remember going into southern Somalia, and I was very, very scared because this was a group that had an allegiance. They were a specific, very powerful militia that had an allegiance with Al-Shabaab, the main insurgent group in Somalia, incredibly brutal group that sort of loosely allied with Al-Qaeda, really, really terrorized the local population very often. This group had recently defected to ally with the Kenyan national forces who were helping push Al-Shabaab away from the border. So their outlook on life, totally the same. This is a cynical, plot move. I go in with another reporter. I was working in TV and the other reporter was a print reporter. We had a connection through a good fixer who knew these people. Everybody has connections to, local journalists who know them. But they allowed us to come because we were going to go and interview their commander and talk to him about this defection. And so you're protected by the fact that the commander has formally invited you. But that felt, the moment that you're in, there's a politeness, there's a here's some food, there's a how do you do, but there's also a sense of confusion because to them we were the enemy very, very recently. So there's a sort of an interesting formal dance, and I've had that a lot. You may work with another group like the Taliban. You go. I remember before they took over the country, whenever we would go and spend time with them, and there's a whole route you've got to go, and they had a formal press office. Even when they were an insurgent group, and you would wait for months and months and months to get approval, and then they would say, "Okay, fine, you can come." And then because of their Pashtun culture, like the hospitality was incredible. I mean, you were like force-fed food, and there was like a lineup of people standing there to shake your hand when you got there. And, it was, they would try to give you a gift, which is terribly awkward because as journalists, you can't take a gift. And so it's so funny because people often forget that there's like many of these cultures are formal. Many of them are power structures. So the boss said we could come. So, and so these are the sorts of experiences I end up having a lot of the time, where some of the foot soldiers might be confused as to why I'm there. Many of them are curious and secretly kind of pleased that they get to sort of stare at this strange alien creature. And a lot of their commanders, they want to talk.
That's fascinating. Just winding back. So you saw, just back to your story. So you were looking at these women journalists on television and being inspired by them. How did you then decide that you were going to start to be a journalist? Did you decide you were going to be a print journalist or a television journalist? And then, I'm wondering if there were two decisions in your mind. One was to be a journalist, and the second was to be a war journalist specifically. Or was that all wrapped up in the same decision?
I think it was wrapped up in the same decision. The war reporting and journalism was tied together as a kid. I think that's partly because I was, to me, as a kid, the big stories were either politics or the actual fighting. And the two were inextricably linked. And the politics seemed boring to me because it didn't involve travel. And all I wanted to do was see the world. And so I think it was ingrained in me that the big stories are these crises. It's the bombing that happened in Belfast, and it's the ambush of those soldiers on the road there. And so I do think on a subconscious level, I made that decision. And then when I was 17 years old, 9/11 happened. And by this stage, I've already decided that's it. I'm a journalist. Like I've got to get this stupid college thing out of the way. And then I can finally go off and do this exciting job in life. And 9/11 really centered the media and the world's attention on places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And so for me, that felt like a natural progression from what I'd seen as a kid. Of course, now I recognize, there's so much incredible journalism all over the world doing, remarkable storytelling. My best friend from college, and we ran the student newspaper together, she's the West Africa bureau chief of the New York Times. And she covers a lot of conflict in West Africa, but her big passion is human stories. She covers like mega churches and fashion shows and it's, she covers culture and society and the world and people. And so, so I'm well aware that that it's sort of silly to think, well, conflict these are the important big stories. It's not really true. But I think that as I was young coming up, these seemed to be the big geopolitical stories, or the stories that impacted millions and millions of people. So I wanted to feel like I was at the center of history, big things that were happening. I knew I wanted to work in TV relatively early on. And it was in part because I absorbed a lot as a very nerdy teenager who read a lot. I read all of the biographies and autobiographies of all of these journalists. And it was always the TV reporters who worked in teams. And I wanted, I grew up reading like Enid Blyton books. So it was like Famous Five and Secret Seven. And I couldn't think of anything more exciting and fun than traveling around with your team. Of course, then economics happened, and it's not like I'm in a team of 10 people on the road, but I am in a team of like 3, 4, including like the local journalists that I work with. And that I knew I wanted to work in teams. Print reporting seemed pretty lonely to be on the road, just you and your notepad, maybe a photographer if it's a huge story. So that mattered to me. And I think also I never had this kind of vanity of wanting to be on the TV in the sense of wanting to be famous, but I was always the kid who wanted to tell the story, and if someone was telling it too slowly, I'd be like, I'd finish it for them, and so I like telling stories in a literal sense. Like I love telling a story. And TV is just that.
Then, so it's much more, and what I'm hearing is that it's the being in teams, and it's being in the exciting places where things are happening, and it's having an impact on a lot of people. And also, it sounds as though you're more at ease with the telling a story orally than in print.
Yes, which I think, I don't know if it's coincidence or I'm over extrapolating, but it's certainly more a part of Irish culture is that level of storytelling, whether it's, it's just a big part of who we are,
What's the best part of being a war correspondent?
Being in places that, in 1 year of your life, I get to be in all the rooms, right? So like, I get to be in the room when the babies are born, or in the room when the peace is negotiated, or the battle plans are being formed. I'm in the chopper when they're heading out. Like, I mean, the kind of inquisitive, nosy, fascinated part of me just gets to be in rooms that I'm not really supposed to be in. And it's really remarkable. I get to, walk into the defense minister's office and be like, hey, how you doing? Let's have a cup of tea. Or, I get to, walk into a rebel group's circle and discussion group, or I get to walk into the central hub of a revolution and where they're secretly meeting. I get to walk into places and be places that are incredible, and so that's the real privilege of it. That's the exciting sense of immediacy and sense of selfishly like a big life,
But it's almost like you're right there where history is being made. I mean, this is what's going to be written in the history books.
Yeah, and
you are writing what is going to be in the history books.
Yeah, and it's and before the writing comes the seeing. There are moments where I'm just like I'm in the Panjshir Valley, watching Ahmed Shah Massoud, this very legendary Tajik commander. I'm watching who was murdered by Al Qaeda. Watching his son getting basically ordained by the Tajiks. I get to be there. I'm like the only foreigner who gets to like stand there in this valley while they're all like Allahu Akbaring around him. And it's really amazing. And I think I described this in the book as like, it's like history just sort of pulls a seat out for you and lets you sit down. Like it's extraordinary.
And what's the worst thing about being a war correspondent?
Feeling like a voyeur. I think that there's always going to be, and I think I got around it. I think I made a certain peace with myself about it by working in public broadcasting. But there's always going to be a conflict that you have to watch and monitor within yourself between ambition and purpose. Because the reality is that we're not aid workers. I'm not a doctor or a nurse or a water engineer or a pilot or a Red Cross coordinator. I'm not. I think the worst part is feeling like you're not helping. And worse than that, not only are you not helping, but if you're not careful, you will let your personal ambition override, even like get to the point of where you don't even notice that because you're there for your career. And so I think that there are moments where you have to catch yourself and say, this is what's happening to all of these people around me right now in this cholera ward, in this malnutrition ward, in this frontline hospital is so much bigger than my career. And I think that takes, you have to be very humble and look at the parts of yourself that are your motivating factors and ask yourself, like, what am I doing here? And am I helping? And that's the hardest part.
How does that change the way that you tell the story? I mean, if you're thinking about, is this for my career or is this to actually help? How does that change in the way that you tell the story?
First of all, you don't center yourself in the story. I mean, you're in it because you're the storyteller, you're the conduit. And I still believe that on-camera correspondence, like we do, like when it's done well, we serve a purpose in the storytelling. We help connect this person with the viewer. But so you very much so center it on other people. And I think you also have to be so by in that I mean, your characters are the main characters. It's not about we got there and look at me and here's how I'm feeling and here's another shot with me in it. And and I think that the other thing you have to do is you have to do storytelling that is very, very, very good quality. Like it has to be, even if that's at the cost of it being perhaps less commercial and perhaps a little less sexy. It has to be reporting where you actually listen to people and report the nuances of the story. And, don't tell the viewer what they want to hear because that makes them feel good and that makes them celebrate you, It may be, something that involves having to put context in, that involves, really having to point out nuances. I just think that the most ethical work you can do is the best work that you like quality, is where I feel like I'm additive. If I do a good job, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm getting promoted or I'm getting, called by, this network next week. Or I'm going to make People magazine this week. Like, often it just means like the less sexy but very, very good work. And, it helps your career in the long term. You are eventually viewed as a person whose work is of a certain quality. But yeah, I it's less bombastic.
It's almost like seeing the long term and just going for quality over the long term and telling the story in a way that is ethical rather than just catching the story in the moment.
Yes. One thing I've learned about, doing that high quality work that might be a bit less bombastic is that, one of the benefits, which has been a very nice side effect that was not unintentional, is I do think you end up setting the tone for younger reporters and younger, newer journalists coming in who you forget are actually watching you in the way that, I might have watched other reporters when I was really a young cub. And I like that because I like, quietly, it's enjoyable to watch people trying to do the same thing because, and obviously, it's flattering, but it's more that you feel like that's the impact, because in a career where you spend your whole time wondering, why am I standing in a collar award without a stethoscope? Or why am I, should I be here? It's nice to feel like you're at least modeling a type of journalism for people coming up.
You feel as though, as a woman, you bring a different perspective in your journalism, and is that something that you actually think about?
It is actually. I do. I've spent a bit of time thinking about this. I think that, first of all, we're not new to this, right? It would be wrong for my generation to claim we're the first generation. There are so many women journalists who have been doing this since long before us. Even Vietnam, there were female war reporters there, and there's a whole generation of female war reporters who are still in the business right now, but who are like veterans. I think that I would argue against the premise that there's no difference between men and women, and that women are just exactly the same as men in these circumstances doing this kind of work. I actually think a lot of women, there's an enormous amount of female war reporters right now, especially in print. There was recently an award given to the reporters of the Washington Post for their Ukraine coverage, who were almost exclusively women. And this is a lot of reporters.
Wow.
When I lived in Beirut, which was from 2014 to 2020, that was where a lot of conflict reporters were based. It was simple to live there. It was relatively safe. It was cheap to live there, and you could bounce around between Iraq, Afghanistan, and also many, many people were covering Syria. At the time, I used to pitch this to print reporters who are, working in magazines in the West. I would be like, you should write a story about the fact that the entire war in Syria is being almost completely covered by women. The bureau chief at the New York Times. You've got, Liz Sly at the Washington Post. You had, Josie Enser at the British Telegraph. Then you have all the broadcast women and networks, like Clarissa Ward and Holly Williams and me and Isabel Young at Vice. They were massively outnumbering men. And it's a little controversial, but I often say, I think women dominate in war reporting because we're really, really good at it. I think women are good at war reporting because I think, we're so terrified of being put in a box of empaths, and we feel sad when people are sad, and therefore because we're sensitive. That's not true entirely, but our empathy is an incredible superpower. I think that we notice details. We have an attention to detail because of that empathy. You're in a hospital ward, and you're connecting with people. We are, of course, and I know that, maybe I'm stereotyping, but I think women are remarkable communicators. I think we're very, very good storytellers. And I know that being a great listener is really what good interviewing is all about. Interviewing is not about what you say. People always ask, how do you come up with your questions? And I'm always like, by listening, and I think women are patient. War zones test our patience enormously, and just very, very physically tough. I think being a woman gives you skill sets that are very, very applicable and useful in conflict zones. I would also say that in terms of the approach to the story, yes, I think that women are naturally often more drawn to understanding the societal context of what's going on, and that's why we're now seeing that as part and parcel of reporting, from wars. It's no longer just frontline updates. It's, how is this impacting, are schools open? Are hospitals able to function? I really believe so much of what you see on TV now, and that we take for granted as normal, is actually, I believe, a lot of it driven by the changes in the industry in recent decades, where more and more women have been, making these editorial decisions to be at the train station, in Kyiv, watching the families being evacuated. That's an editorial choice, and I think a lot of those choices are impacted by the fact that more women are doing this work.
So women are giving a perspective which is really about the impact of the war on the entire society.
I think women have a very good eye for the threads that connect. Like what's the connective tissue in society, and how's that being impacted by this conflict, rather than just trying to capture bang bang. And not all my male colleagues just do that. Many of them do great humanist reporting, but I think that it's being very much so pushed forward by the prevalence of female war reporters.
I mean, I find that incredibly interesting that there are so many now female reporters.
It's interesting that when you got to read the bylines in print newspapers, like so many of them are female, and it's weird that like most people don't really know that. The amount of interviews I do where they're like, wow, so rare to meet a woman doing this kind of work. And I was like, I'm not sure that it is,
Have there been situations in your career what have been the situations when you've been most terrified? Have there been situations where you've been terrified, or does that just, you get used to it?
Yes, there have been situations. I mean, I write about this a lot, that I'm scared a lot in my work. There are there's plenty of things that have become less scary to me, like landing into airports in war zones and not having a driver yet, or there are things that don't intimidate me anymore, that are fairly normal, but danger is still extremely scary, and it should be. I write about how, I was a super anxious kid, had terrible anxiety, and back then no one really told you have anxiety. You just lived thinking that it was normal to be afraid all the time. and so I think one thing that has helped is the ability to coexist with fear and not let it become a particularly dominant force that makes decisions for me, unless it's very much so rational. So I do feel fear, but I would say terrified and fear are very different things. And thankfully, there have only been a couple of times in my career where I felt really, 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 really afraid. And I think that's where, you sort of start stepping into a sort of more trauma experience where, I talk to other journalists about this. There's, roughly speaking, to me, there's two categories. There's, oh my goodness, this is dangerous. Oh my God, this is pretty dangerous. And then there is, oh no, I might die. And then there are moments, mercifully rare, where it feels like death is a certainty. And that's the worst feeling in the world, because it's fear, but it's also a deep sense of, I've just really fucked up and I can't undo it. And I'm filled with regret. And only once in my career did I really, really think, and I was trying to get out of Syria in the early days of the war, and this activist was trying to smuggle me out, but in full view of Syrian forces. And it was during the early days of the insurgency, and they were picking everybody up and just torturing people to death in jails. It was really, really awful. Like, the idea of getting caught was just almost worse than fear, almost worse than death. And I was really, really scared, because at one point, gunmen did step out and stop the vehicle. And it really felt like different. That kind of terrifying felt different from healthy, regular, oh my goodness, we're being shot at, quick run fear. Because it felt filled with the certainty of death and the sadness and regret of it. And that was a feeling I would not wish upon my worst enemy. And so I definitely have been very lucky to avoid that feeling and that situation mostly since.
How did that particular situation play itself out in Syria?
It's interesting. First of all, I was there as a youngster. I was alone. I was 27 years old and I was working for Al Jazeera, and I went alone. I was sent alone with a group of activists who had said, and they were bringing journalists in and out. It was the very, very early days. And they hadn't brought any American networks or foreign networks beyond. They'd brought in, I think, Sky News and El País newspaper. And everyone was being snuck into this small neighborhood, which had taken up arms against the might of the Assad regime. And I mean, the likelihood of success was very, very low. But I was going to, the plan was, and I had like a flak jacket, a handy cam, and $10,000. And I was like stumbling across, the fields of northern Lebanon in the dark with these activists and like crawling under fences to get into Syria. It was wildly dangerous. And the activists were fairly nihilistic, and I was very young and I was very keen to prove myself. And this was by far the biggest assignment I'd ever been given. Like, this was the biggest story in the world, this uprising against the Assad regime in January 2012. And I couldn't believe that Al Jazeera were giving it to me. They were giving it to me because I was a young freelancer. And if I got caught, they could I was the guinea pig. And so they had all these big star reporters who were sort of cross that they weren't going. And so this was a big opportunity for me. And I was determined to go in. And the plan would be I'd probably stay for like up to a week. But I got in and I was pretty plucky. I'd covered Somalia. I'd covered the, urban warfare, the battle for Mogadishu in 2010-11. I had covered, the uprisings in Yemen. I had done a lot. I'd been to Afghanistan, but this was like a type of fear that I just couldn't shake, that like, I might die here, and that these people don't have this neighborhood secure, and that they're all prepared to die. And they've told me that themselves. And so I gathered all that I could. I filmed everything that I could, and I got loads. Like, I ended up doing like this whole 3-part series. It was a huge exclusive. It was very, very successful for my career. But I left after 3 days in the country rather than the week. And I was so ashamed because I felt like, well, that's not what you're supposed to do. War reporters, you're supposed to just hard charge and not worry about being afraid. And I thought that I was, and I wrote the title of the chapter, that precedes an earlier chapter in the book that precedes this is called Chicken Shit. And it's sort of like a kind of play on the fact that I was working in a chicken factory before college. But that was the sort of horrible term that was running through my head. And I was so ashamed that I'd left, but I just felt like something terrible was going to happen and I needed to leave. And it was fine. The stories all aired. They had a huge impact. Like, everybody watched them. I was very shaken by this experience. I think in retrospect, I think I had PTSD from that experience. And I flew to Istanbul. I met my boyfriend at the time for after the pieces had aired, and I'd done all the in-studio work and the big reveal. And I went there and I was really, really shaken. And I was really there to try to sort of right myself. And I remember sitting at the table in the hotel room, and that it was then that I found out that Marie Colvin had been killed. And she had been the journalist they'd brought in after me, after I'd left, and brought into the exact same building where the insurgents, where the revolution was being run from. And I just couldn't believe it. And I write about this, I would never, ever, feel shame at following my instincts ever again. There was something about being there where I thought, I'm going to die here. And I think that was a big moment in growing up. as a reporter, and like not doing ridiculously dangerous things to try to prove myself. That was a very, very quick moment, leap into maturity.
Proving yourself something that was important to you?
I think it was, I think it's partly a female thing. We want to prove that we're just as tough as the guys. We certainly are used to being underestimated. I hadn't had a very conventional route in the industry. I hadn't gone to a fancy school or like had an Ivy League education. I didn't have any family connections. And when I got out of college, the financial crisis happened. And it was really, 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 really hard to get into journalism because it was just sort of collapsing and no one was hiring. I mean, some people, if they had, connections, they could get an internship or a job, but I just couldn't get a job. And so, but there's nothing else I wanted to do. This is all I'd ever wanted to do. There was no plan B. And so I had to freelance. And I think that there was always a part of me felt like an outsider, like I hadn't been thus anointed and, claimed and promoted by a network. So I think that had a role to play in it. And I think I always felt like, a lot of people don't realize that a lot of the media, especially TV, attracts people from extraordinarily privileged backgrounds. Foreign correspondency can be quite a sort of, it's a career that draws a lot of people from extreme privilege. And I still think there was a small part of me felt like I had to somehow compensate for being this little redneck kid, who didn't go to Harvard or Oxford, and who maybe I thought, well, the one thing I have to offer the world is my courage and my grit. And I know I'm physically tough. So I think that fed into me feeling the need to prove myself.
I wanted to ask you some questions. This is really for my personal interest because they're things that I wonder about. One is, do you think, and has your experience been, but I just wonder that if we have more women in power, that there will actually be less conflict. I don't know if you've formed a view about that.
I do think that there would be less conflict. I don't think there'd be none, but I think there would be significantly less. I do. I think that the reality is people always say, oh, but what about Margaret Thatcher and Golda Meir? And like, there's always, examples of female state leaders who went to war. I don't believe, I think that in certain patriarchal leadership circles, I do believe that there is a tendency toward war as a means to an end more quickly. But I also think, and I would say more importantly, there is, I think, more of a fear of emasculation related embarrassment at capitulating or negotiating and coming to the peace talks earlier. I think that negotiations are often female-led, should be, and often are more successful if they are. And I think that wars would end more quickly if you had female leadership. When I think of like some of the greatest diplomats out there, many of them women, I don't think that's a coincidence. I think, and as you and I have talked about here, when it comes to the connective tissue of societies, I do think in many cases women are better at seeing the big picture of what is trying to be achieved. And I think that is everything when it comes to negotiations and to peace negotiations. Seeing a big picture of what everybody wants and how best to get it to them, rather than being singular in their outlook. I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist, and I'm not, a doctor, but I can only say what I see in terms of female behavior. It's not because I think women are not predisposed to violence. I think women can be violent, but I think that women have a much broader perspective on different points of view and how to operate in that way. I think that, they see the interconnectedness of society, and I think that feeds into on a more global, even just regional scale. There's a reason that aid agencies still continue to hand the food out to the women. It's not because, they love their kids, so they'll give it to their kids. They do love their kids and they will give it to their kids, but they understand how food and families and communities work, and I think that would certainly lead to a more peaceful world. It would not eliminate war. But I do think it would help, bring a lot more negotiated settlements in the world. And that's very important, because one thing that most people are unaware of and that really, really worries me is that wars are getting longer. They are so much more intractable than they ever were. And I think that's something that really concerns me. And I obviously, we want to prevent wars breaking out, but if we can also, help resolve conflict, I think that could actually have a much bigger impact right now.
Is there a reason why they're getting longer, do you think?
In part, I believe it's because they are fewer, they're partly because of technology, but also because, both sides are very often well supplied, supply lines. Wars don't sort of burn out because both sides can continue to fight for a very, very long time. At the end of the day, very few wars are won. They all end up in some sort of settlement. And I don't mean, they're not won outright. And so, weapons will continue to flow and funding and support will continue to flow. And that's in part because so many wars now are proxy conflicts. Everything is sort of this sort of multi-layered global geopolitical power play. And that is really, really extending conflicts, rather than, and it demotivates peace negotiations, in some ways. You can make the argument, of course, if in many wars do need to be supplied, people need to be able to protect themselves, or world order needs to be protected, like Russia just invading Ukraine. What the repercussions for, global security and world order are incredibly grave. But at the same time, the more you arm a conflict, the longer it's likely to go on. Some would make the other opposite argument. Some would say, no, it'll come to an end if we just help these people, win it. Like, look at, dropping nuclear weapons on Japan. But that's the most extreme example you have for saying, well, the more we arm, the more we can quickly end wars. In reality, wars are ended in peace negotiations.
The other question I wanted to ask you, which is something that I find just astounding, and I really don't understand, is the role of rape in war. I don't know if it happens to the same extent it used to, but I just don't understand why soldiers who are in conquering armies feel the need to rape women. I just don't understand it. And I don't know if you have any sort of perspective on that?
I don't understand it on an individual level. I understand rape used as a weapon of war. That has happened. And I mean, I've interviewed victims of rape as a weapon of war in South Sudan, for instance, where you had an ethnic conflict, and this was very much so about punishing a community, and very much so about, this ethnicity of men raping this ethnicity of women as an attack on the community, as an attack on the men, but also, in a brutal way, as an attempt to sort of even impregnate women of an opposing ethnicity. So I can understand it in a sort of dark way, or tactical way, but the reality is that it would appear to me that most of the rape that happens at the hands of a marauding, conquering army is not strategic. It is opportunistic. It is no different from a rape that happens in Central Park when a woman is overpowered. And therefore I think that rape, I don't understand rape as a concept in the sense that where does violence and sex meet? Like, where is the confluence point for the desire to overpower someone? I don't even know how a man could be sexually aroused in a moment of such horror and violence and fear and distress. I don't know how that physically would work, but perhaps a psychiatrist or a doctor could explain it to me. But I do know that war can provide an incubator for acts that are extreme and extremely taboo, and effectively outlawed in a literal sense, but also socially outlawed in normal circumstances in any culture. And that sense that war is hell is the sense that, like, what it is this total breakdown of societal rules. And in that moment, you're not only going to have these anarchistic elements of people acting on their basest, most dark impulses, but I think you also have men who are the living and breathing kind of embodiment of force. I mean, that's what war is. That's what a soldier is to do, is to use violence to achieve a means. That's a way of life in a conflict. And so I think when you marry that with what seems like no repercussions, no rules, societal breakdown, that's where I if you're looking at, say, for instance, a village in eastern Ukraine and Russian soldiers coming in and raping women, it's not really a weapon of war. It might be used to terrify, further communities down the road, but in reality, I suspect it's more men out of control, and they have the means, and they have all the power. If you have guns and you just took over a village and all the men are dead or gone, that's probably the most powerful in a one-on-one level a man will ever be.
And it's like it's societal. I mean, I hadn't thought before of war as a concept of it's basically just societal breakdown. And so all that's left is an expression of power.
Yeah. And there's nothing more powerless than, a woman hiding in her house, alone, unarmed. And so when you think about, how do you, as a commander, at what point are you asking men to switch from use force, to the point of like dehumanizing the opposition, the enemy, to being like, well, no, we've taken this village. Now these are civilians and these are people who we are protecting. I mean, that's the sort of, that's how we like to think things work. But very often they don't. And very often presented with the opportunity to use that, awesome and terrible power, some men do. What I don't understand is the sexual impulse of it. Like, that's a whole other conversation. Like how, you, in that moment, you're thinking that's what you want to do. Like, I can understand anger. I can understand murder. I can understand stealing, but I don't understand sex in that moment. But that's a question for a psychiatrist.
Yeah. I mean, I'm with you on that. I just don't understand it. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the book. When you were writing the book, are there things that you learned about yourself surprised you?
Oh my goodness, so much. I mean, that was part of the joy of writing it, was so much of it is coming to understand yourself. Like, it's really remarkable seeing connections. I almost came to, and I think that perhaps a lot of people who are more experienced memoirists would nod and say, of course, that's what happens. But you start to see yourself in the third person, like Jane, the little girl, Jane, the young woman, Jane, the college kid. To me, I'm watching her, and she is separate from me, and I'm watching her, and I learned a lot about myself. I learned some uncomfortable truths, that like I felt like an outcast, but in many ways I was not leaning into the industry. I was not, I was always wanting to go off and do my own thing. I could see these like you can just start to see your life reflect your personality in such a fascinating way. God, I look back and I just think she was so hard on herself. Like, wow. Like, you're just, because I can remember the feeling of feeling like I'd failed or hadn't done a good job, or, like all of the times that when you're kind of critiquing yourself. And now I'm looking back going, my God, like, she was really just doing her best. And it's to look back at yourself with that gentle kindness is something that was very new to me, because I think I would always be, trying to be better, trying to be faster, trying to do better. And I think it's very, very, very good exercise to look back at yourself and sort of give that young woman a hug. I didn't do that a lot when I was younger. I also think it's very important. I've really learned, when I decided I want to write this book, I really, really wanted to tear away a lot of the mystique of the war reporter, where I think that we're far too lionized as heroes, or in the current era we're living in, like fake news journalists are demonized. But I didn't want to write another book of just like, a book by a conflict reporter that was sort of like bang, bang stories, or adventures on the road, like I actually wanted to be seen, to say, this is not a book about a career. This is a book about a person. And so as I started writing it, I realized that I really, really had to dig deep, had to write some very uncomfortable truths about my childhood. I had to understand myself on an unbelievably, in-depth level. And that was really rewarding to do, to look back and understand one's own origin story. Like, why am I the way I am? And I opened the book by saying that, like, us conflict reporters tend to say, why do we, to answer the question, why do we do what we do? We tend to be very much so like, well, I wanted to speak truth to power. And it's true. We do, we do this work because we really believe in it. but there's more to our stories than that. We are an interesting, very sort of complex bunch of people. And I think that digging into that is does a service, I think, is hopefully additive and helpful to help people really understand, who it is off doing that work and telling you that story.
Some of the things that you say actually move me quite strongly, because when you say I was so hard on myself, that's what people said to me. They have said that to me hundreds and hundreds of times. You were so hard on yourself. And I think that's such an important message to people who are listening, people to read the book, women, to say, have compassion for us. We're just doing our best.
Right.
We're just doing our best. And I think that we can be so hard on ourselves and expect so much. And we're actually doing pretty well. And the other thing that really struck me in what you said was, I just wanted to be seen. Yeah. I wanted to be seen. And I know that really resonates with me in my career trajectory as well. So I think that it's a very deep-seated need, just wanting to be seen for who we are.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially whenever, you are a professional who people have, and perhaps, you've also cultivated a certain image of yourself, like that, there's a lens people see you through. And that's not necessarily a bad one. But it is also not entirely yourself. And, I really do believe that, and so much of the book is me trying to figure out, me driven by a sense of wanting to feel belonging, wanting to find home. And I'm wandering around the world trying to find home in a lot of places and trying to figure out a way to belong. And, I really have, I really do believe what I've read, that, that to belong is to be actually seen and to be understood. And so much of writing this book was about trying to be understood, and whenever you do the kind of work where people lionize you or they demonize you, it's very easy to get lost in other people's ideas of who you are. And so I that's why it had to be very warts and all. So very much so a story of a human being. And it was pretty terrifying doing that. I mean, it was really cathartic when I'm in the library and I'm typing away and I'm like, oh, this feels so great. I'm giving my younger me a hug. Oh, so great. And then when it comes to publication day, like I can't sleep because this is the most terrifying thing I've ever done in my life. And I've done a lot of scary things. So it's all well and good to be like, oh, it's so cathartic. But like, it could have gotten panned, or people could have been very angry, or people could have been offended, or, so it's pretty scary.
Wow. Well, I had the experience of doing a one-woman show. And when I saw the video, I think it was the same sort of thing. It was like, oh my God, that is my words. It's me acting. It's like I've just, opened myself up and said, hey, world, have a look inside. I mean, it was just, not good at it.
Yeah.
But I also think it's when we're able to get that level of openness that we're able to connect with other people.
Yeah, exactly. You can't really connect when you're sort of presenting a version of yourself, Yeah. I mean, you can do your job very well, but I think that, and also, if I'm asking someone to spend $30 and, several days of their life sitting down and reading this, like, I feel like, I owe someone something authentic. So it's an exchange that I think is more fair.
For the $30 for authenticity.
Right.
Thanks.
Everything is so loud and there's so many people talking at this point. Like, I didn't want to show up until I had something real to say.
Saying we've been going for a long time on this. I could go for far longer. Is there anything that you would like to say? Anything that we've missed out? Anything at all? Yeah, you'd like to force with?
I think let me think about that for a second.
Or a message for people who are listening.
Sure. I would definitely, what I love about these conversations, especially this kind of conversation, is that, I think that we can talk about female experiences in particular without leaning too much into a rote sort of identity politics of it. Like I was very, very happy and honored. It just made me happy that a reviewer of the book, one review came in and said that I acknowledge the peculiarities and particularities of being a woman doing this work, but I don't let myself be defined by it. And I think so many of these conversations, because I want to talk to women about talk with women about these experiences and careers and what it's like. But so often I find the conversation not as organic as this that you and I have been having, but very often it's like, well, what are the challenges and how do you push back? And it's not that there aren't challenges, and there are like many unique experiences to women, but I think that we can have way more nuanced conversations about the female experience without it being that, I think it's very singular when we say the female experience is one of me feeling like a victim, me feeling like I don't have power, I need to get power. And, because it's really, that happens. And I talk about this in the book, how much pressure there is on women to look a certain way, how, we're not supposed to age after a certain age. It's terribly ageist industry. And so I talk about those things, and those are important to mention. But I think that where the real casual, extraordinary power of women is when we're talking about the changes that that we make in our reporting. How we're different, how we're better, how we're faster. Just sort of celebrating all of the how far we've come. And so I do want to, break any glass ceiling and push back against challenges. But I guess what I'd like to say is that, these sorts of conversations where we get into what we're doing right, what we're good at, what we're interested in, what frustrates us, I just think that there's a lot more power there than we think, rather than the need to constantly talk about our own personal wars with the structures that we're working in, because I just think that we're already kind of starting to transcend them. We transcend them more when we just presume to be brilliant at what we do, and to have these conversations about the impact that that's having on our workplace and our world.
Well, I mean, I love that message. And I love that. I believe so strongly in that if we just focused on what we want, or what we think is important, what we think is ethical, what we believe is right, and just go for it, often there's a lot less stopping us than we think.
Agreed.
Thank you so much, Jane. It's been a huge pleasure speaking to you. I've really, really, really loved this conversation. Thank you.
Me too. Thank you. This is a terrific conversation.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Brave New Women. certain podcast sites such as Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, or Podchaser let you leave a rating and a review. The more ratings and reviews we get, the more people will listen and the more these women's stories will be shared. So I'd really appreciate it if you could. Thanks for listening.